How does a company with $15 billion in revenue and 100,000 employees worldwide not have a corporate compliance program? What is the role of compliance in mergers and acquisitions? Matt Kelly and I take up these questions and others in the WPP enforcement action on compliance into the weeds. I know you will enjoy this episode. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, the voice of compliance, back again with Matt Kelly, the coolest guy in compliance, for another episode of Compliance into the Weeds. Today, we're going to take up the second FCPA enforcement action of 2021, the WPP enforcement action. This follows the AMEC Foster Wheeler one earlier this year, and although we've definitely had a dearth of enforcement actions, we've had two delicious ones. So, Matt, first of all, welcome, and we've both written about this case, but I wanted to start off by asking you why do you find this case so delicious?
Oh, boy, where to begin with this one? So I think there are a couple of telling details and questions unanswered about WPP. First, the enforcement action itself was $19 million imposed by the Securities and Exchange Commission for poor internal accounting controls. Out of the $19 million that they imposed in total, $8 million of that, which is 42% of the total, $8 million of that was a penalty. The rest was disgorgement of ill-gotten gains and interest. We see that all the time. But we haven't often seen penalties that were such a large portion of the total. We should add $19 billion for WPP. This is the world's largest advertising firm. They had $15 billion in revenue last year. So it's not a lot of money, but in addition to coughing up all the profits they should never have made, I was intrigued that the SEC had this $8 million penalty. It seems to me that they were pretty annoyed with this action. The action itself, listeners, don't die of shock, but this involved overseas subsidiaries and third-party intermediaries and false documentation and violation of policies. Oh no, we've never heard that before. Principally, the prime offender was in India, and we can get to that, but they also had subsidiaries that were in Brazil and China and Peru that also engaged in bribery, where there were numerous red flags that should have been caught and were left unaddressed. The other thing that it did interest me was specifically about the India subsidiary, where in the mid-2010s, some good-hearted whistleblower was providing complaints about the India subsidiary, a local WPP firm called Mindset, that had been bribing and setting up sham vendor agreements and all this stuff. But the whistleblower gave 7 complaints over the course of 2 years to WPP's corporate office, and they mishandled the investigation into that. And these complaints were clear and specific, and they were naming actual names of both the Mindset CEO and the state governor in India who was involved in this. It was some sort of media relations agency within Indian state governments that was paying Mindset to execute media advertising campaigns, and there were all the usual third-party nonsense we can get into. We do not know where is the Justice Department on this, because this is some pretty egregious ignoring of red flags. I would think that since the Justice Department could enforce against WPP, that maybe they would, but they haven't yet. We haven't seen any action or statement from Justice, so where are they? And then, Tom, my last interesting point about WPP is that a lot of this seems to be tied to the firm's strategy for growth, which was to grab local self-founded small advertising firms around the world in high-risk markets. They would grab a small local advertising firm that had been founded and was still run by the founder. They would keep the founder on, give that founder an earn-out, which is not at all uncommon. And for those who don't know, it's basically just a performance bonus. We've acquired your company. If it hits these targets in 2 or 3 years, we'll give you this much more as part of the purchase price. But it seems to me that the earnouts became this sort of weaponized incentive to commit fraud at these places. The subsidiaries were still run by these owners who basically were thinking, if I can commit fraud and corruption, I'm going to hit these performance targets, I'm going to get my earnout, and then I get to retire and ride off into the sunset. So I was curious to see how these earnouts and these incentive pay really got, warped and metastasized into this vehicle for bribery, or this incentive to commit bribery, and we could talk about that too. But there's a lot in this case which at first glance doesn't seem like the biggest thing we've seen, but there's a lot of stuff in here.
So I'd like to maybe take a step back, Matt, and start with an early paragraph in the SEC order. And it said that despite the known corruption and fraud risk inherent in the acquisition strategy, WPP lacked sufficient internal accounting controls with respect to its expansive international network. Additionally, and here's the money shot, ladies and gentlemen, quote, WPP had no compliance department during the relevant period, end quote, and lacked meaningful coordination between its legal and internal audits and its foreign subsidiary management. We don't know, there's no definition of the relevant period, so I don't know if that is from 2010 up to 2019 when the last bribery scheme was discovered. But, Matt, I cannot remember an enforcement action over the last 5 years where there was no compliance department. We've seen insufficient compliance departments. We've seen compliance departments being overridden by corporate office. We've seen compliance functions that don't talk to each other across geographic boundaries. But I don't recall ever seeing no compliance department during the relevant period over the last 10 years. Do you?
I don't, and that was the thing that bugged me about this case, and we should, there was another phrase you had just uttered there, Tom, that coordination, or the lack thereof, between legal and internal audit at WPP. So WPP had some rudimentary compliance capabilities. They had anti-corruption policies in Brazil, which the Brazil subsidiary violated. They found some red flags, such as the internal audit team found evidence of tax avoidance scams in China in a WPP subsidiary. They could have taken some real action if they wanted, because Mindset in India, which was, as I said, the prime offender there, somebody was reporting that misconduct to WPP, but there was no compliance function that could have picked up all of these compliance capabilities that were kind of laying around on the table and put them into a real program to be able to go to senior management and say, we have a big systemic issue here, and we need to investigate what's going on in Brazil, investigate China, knock this thing off with Mindset in India. But there was nobody there to do that, so we had these spasms of compliance activity here and there that kind of burst out and then went away and flared out, and there was never really much action. And the result is this unfortunate settlement order with the SEC with a high portion of penalties, because I think the SEC was annoyed at what was happening here. And there was just some, like they said, lots of red flags that just continued to flap in the breeze undisturbed, because there was nobody there to say, this is a flag, we have to address it.
Matt, there's lots of questions that this enforcement action brought up for me, and you named a couple of them. Where's the Department of Justice? And perhaps we can get to some of the others later, but I read a lot into the order by what was not present. And one of the things that was not present in the order was any discussion of pre-acquisition investigation and due diligence, post-acquisition integration, post-acquisition training, or even a full forensic audit after the acquisitions were made. And so it seemed like there was a complete lack of that compliance, those steps of any sort of compliance program. But then, as you noted, there were lots of red flags raised. They were raised in India, they were raised in China, they were raised in Brazil. And I was wondering, from even with those red flags raised, the investigations undertaken by WPP in many cases fell far short of identifying any issues. What did you see in the red flags that were identified, and really the lackadaisical or lackluster approach of WPP after the 7 separate internal whistleblower reports in India and those in China?
Well, I thought that the India one was the most telling, and so I'll talk a little bit about that. For example, the first complaint about the India subsidiary, which was, as I said, that firm Mindset, that arrived in July of 2015, and WPP had its financial director for the India region investigate this allegation. But what the director did was he or she hired an international audit firm to please look into the matter, which the audit firm did, but all that the audit firm did was rely on information provided by Mindset and the CEO. They gathered no other outside evidence, and so ultimately they passed that on up the food chain to the finance director and maybe his or her superiors, but nobody ever stopped the troubling relationship there between Mindset and a third party. That was what it was. There was a differential in the prices people were paying for contracts and subcontracts. The differential funded the bribes, and apparently all of this was laid out by the whistleblower who named the Mindset CEO. 6 complaints later, by the 7th complaint, this whistleblower was also naming the Indian government officials who were collaborating with the Mindset CEO. What finally happened in 2017 was that WPP's legal department decided to take a look, and they hired a due diligence firm, which immediately found all sorts of overlap between the Mindset CEO and the state official. They also had found email conversations between Mindset's CEO and CFO on email that had been stored on WPP servers in the United States. So that information had been right there under WPP's nose, and they did not look at that. The investigation, apparently from 2015 and 16 into 2017, a lot of it was just, oh, well, we asked Mindset, and they said it's fine, so whatever. I guess that's what happened, until the legal department finally brought in the relevant expertise and right away found the smoking gun evidence on WPP's own email servers. So, you could have done that years before, and you didn't. And that, to me, spoke volumes about the lack of a serious investigation into this. That's the sort of thing that I would suspect regulators would frown upon. Certainly looks like the SEC frowned upon it. Tom, I'm going to plead ignorance here. I did not read the China one that closely. I do know that the internal audit team looked in, found what I think was a tax avoidance of some kind. I don't necessarily know all the details, if you want to fill in the listeners, but what's striking here is that there were all of these clues and an ability to find all this stuff if you just took it seriously and you looked. And at least in India, they didn't for far too long.
Right, and in China, we had an equally egregious situation where an internal audit in 2017 determined that the Chinese unit was employing a tax avoidance scheme and other significant violations of WPP's accounting controls, to the point where the internal auditors informed WPP management that the China business unit could face criminal charges for its tax avoidance scheme. This was coupled with the China business unit CEO working through personal social connections to get to the appropriate Chinese tax authority director, an attempt to, quote, control the direction of the tax audit. And then finally, and this is something we haven't really seen in terms of a red flag, Matt, was that the audit team actually interviewed the Chinese official after a favorable tax ruling came back. And by favorable, I mean they were relieved of some $3 million potential dollars of tax liability. They interviewed the Chinese tax authority director, and he could give no reason, no basis in Chinese law and any facts as to the relieving of the tax obligations. And that was cited as a red flag. We've really not seen that before in an enforcement action. So once again, lots going on. And I think, as you said, Matt, in Peru, the only reason they discovered the bribery scheme there was in an unrelated audit or an unrelated investigation. And somehow that scheme came out because they were using subsidiaries from other countries to get around the internal controls. So lots of creative internal control jumping, but as you said, about as strongly as I've seen you say in your blog post, these red flags were not present. They were being wagged in the face of management. And management either chose to ignore them, didn't see them, or something else. Really, any kind of thoughts around those areas? We'll be right back with Matt's answer after a word from our sponsor. Look, 2020 has proven to be the year of many things, and the same for 2022. But if you're a small business, this could also be the year you switch to a better payroll. Gusto wasn't just built for small businesses, it was built for the people behind them. Their online payroll is easy to use. Gusto can automatically calculate paychecks and file all your payroll taxes, which means you have more time to run your business. Plus, Gusto does way more than payroll. Gusto helps with time tracking, health insurance, 401ks, onboarding, commuter benefits, offer letters, access to HR experts. You get the idea. It's super easy to set up and get started. If you're moving from another provider, they can transfer all your data for you. It's no surprise that 94% of customers are likely to recommend Gusto. And here's the best part. Because you're a listener to this podcast, you get 3 months totally free. All you have to do is go to gusto.com/compliance. That's gusto.com/compliance. I'm telling you, you're going to love Gusto. Get started today.
It really is something. Well, it gets back to, like I said, basic compliance capabilities and putting them to good use. I especially liked the details about the Peruvian subsidiary that was brokering bribes with the construction firm for the mayor of Lima, but funneling them through other WPP subsidiaries in Chile and Colombia. Right away, any person worth their salt would have said, why is a Peruvian client working with Chilean and Colombian subsidiaries when we have a business for them in Peru? And it's elementary stuff. So it really does just speak to the greater corporate culture that I suspect WP either condoned or maybe they just never explained to local founders that you have to pay attention to all of this. I know that WPP and its senior managers have had some other issues about business conduct flare up from time to time. It's just, it was a lot of growth over the 2010s, and this was the sort of stuff that they did not invest in a compliance infrastructure to keep pace with the risks that were proliferating there. Now, did they not know that they should boost up the compliance? Did they not care that they should boost up the compliance program? Now, I'm not going to say, I'm not really sure, but that's what it was. It was hyper-growth and a lot of pressure to hit targets and not any investment in the compliance function to keep all of that from going off the rails, which ultimately is exactly what happened.
Sir Martin Sorrell led WPP up until 2018 when he retired, and he gave a statement to the Financial Times which said, quote, "I had no part or involvement in the settlement between the SEC and WPP. My personal commitment to compliance and controls during almost 50 years of value creation has been rigorous and remains so. I note that there have been terminations of only senior executives and other employees at YPP involved in the misconduct as a consequence. I left WPP as a good leaver, as its statement of April 14, 2018 made clear." Matt, when I first thought that, I initially thought, Richard Nixon would have been proud of this statement. That's the greatest denial I have ever seen. But upon further reflection, he goes even beyond Tricky Dicky because he makes clear that the people who were in the know above the frontline people doing it weren't touched. And he said it's only senior executives and other employees involved in the misconduct. So there's no consequence, apparently, for more senior management. Now, perhaps that's not the role of the SEC. But that leads to maybe a series of questions we can end with. And we talked about kind of where is the DOJ on this. But number one, how on earth did WPP avoid a monitor? Because at least of 2018 or maybe even 2019, they sure were not committed or had the value of compliance. And I don't know how you take a company that was running this lax an internal control system and turn them around $15 billion. It's still $15 billion, and 100,000 people is a lot of people that you have to, that's a huge ocean-going yacht that you have to turn. And I don't know how you can do that really without a monitor. So really, any thoughts on the monitor issue?
I mean, I would expect that if the Justice Department acts on this, then we should ask that question. I don't know that the SEC particularly would assign a monitor to a settlement. And the greater question is, we don't know that the DOJ has moved on from this, or they're still looking at it, or what this resolution might be. But I am struck that really this is the sort of misconduct that is tailor-made for the Justice Department to weigh in and do something. Clearly, they were ignoring whistleblowers. I am surprised that there wasn't any allegations of retaliation. So maybe there will be in some other future enforcement action from DOJ if we see it. But it was more like, read through the guidance. The guidance about having an effective compliance program. They didn't have one. They literally did not have a compliance program. I am hard pressed to see how you can satisfy the expectations of the Justice Department on a compliance program when you don't have one to begin with. And this was a huge company for many years. They certainly should have. I mean, here was Martin Sorrell saying that, of course, he took it so seriously. Whatever. I mean, you can say whatever you need to make yourself feel better, but clearly the evidence is they weren't taking it seriously. So I don't know where the Justice Department is on this. Maybe they're going to have a separate action on their own. I'm curious that typically for egregious cases, and this wasn't a huge one, but it was egregious for what it was. In egregious cases, as I recall, Tom, we would see the DOJ and SEC announce these things together, and we haven't. Maybe they are working with the Serious Fraud Office, since WPP is headquartered in London and listed in New York as well. So maybe the SFO is still putting together a case, and there's going to be some sort of joint action here. I would be really puzzled if there isn't some sort of further step from DOJ plus others. And we'll have to wait and see.
Well, that really brings up the next question that I wanted to deliciously explore with you, Matt, and that is, where is the SFO? WPP is a Jersey incorporated company. Now, there's U.S. jurisdiction because they have shares. They have ADR shares. So there's no question that there's U.S. jurisdiction. Additionally, and is specifically pointed out in the SEC order, emails detailing the bribery scheme were held on American servers, and that's enough to create U.S. jurisdiction as well. But, I mean, this is a U.K. company, and where is, why isn't the SFO involved? As you suggested, perhaps they're working with the Department of Justice. But this seems to me to be a tailor-made case for the Serious Fraud Office under the UK Bribery Act.
Well, Tom, maybe they're stuck on the M5 highway outside of London and they ran out of gas, since they have no gas in London at the moment. But I don't know. And this would be another of a series of unfortunate incidents with the SFO, that it's now at this point, they've got a reputation of not really being able to close big cases and big deals. And if they ignore this, or I don't know, the WPP takes it to trial or something like that, or a judge in the British system strikes down whatever the SFO might be trying to do, I think that would just be one more black eye in a series of punches that the SFO has taken over the last 10 years or so. But again, how could you not have an action against this? This wasn't really just any sort of run-of-the-mill ineptitude. I mean, there were there was clear, specific, compelling allegations of serious misconduct happening, and they didn't do anything about it. And so I suspect we have not heard the end of this. I don't know who we're going to hear it from, but at the least, somebody somewhere from DOJ or SFO, if they're not going to take any action, geez, they should really tell the rest of us, what are you thinking about why you wouldn't? I see what the SEC has done. There were a lot of weak accounting controls here that that needed some attention. To a certain extent, maybe that is the easier thing to bring forward if there was a lot of evidence there. I don't know, but it's a very interesting question. Where are the criminal prosecutors in this case?
So let me pose yet another question, Matt. There's nothing in the SEC order which would indicate how the SEC was made aware of these allegations. There is no report of a whistleblower. There is no report that the company self-disclosed. It's completely silent. In the near the end of the order, the SEC said it considered the remedial acts undertaken by WPP and the cooperation it afforded to the SEC as well. Once again, no mention of self-disclosure. So really, any thoughts around how this may have gotten? Is it one of the 7 whistleblowers or the person who whistleblew 7 times? Is there somebody overseas getting a big whistleblower award out of this? Anything either between the lines or that your own research has uncovered?
My own research has uncovered nothing other than, as you said, they don't actually disclose how they heard about this. I will say that if the maximum whistleblower payout from the SEC is 30%, then 30% of $19.1 million would be $5.73 million. So someday, a year or two down the road, if we hear about a mystery whistleblower who wins a $5.7 million award, I would not be surprised at that. Clearly, this whistleblower or whistleblowers in India, at least, whomever they were being ignored. I could certainly see those persons being frustrated and saying, I'm just going to take it to the law and see what happens. But no, they are notably silent on how they figured this out. And the words voluntary self-disclosure did not come up when you search for that in the SEC orders.
That brings up another point that we might explore as well, Matt. We both talked about the number of whistleblower reports made to WPP management. What we don't know is if it was a single whistleblower multiple times or multiple whistleblower single times or a combination thereof. But when you have 7 separate reports, as the SEC order noted, with increasing specificity down to naming of names and positions, it seems you have a highly motivated employee, at least in terms of internal reporting. And if that's one whistleblower with 7 separate reports, that's a pretty dedicated whistleblower before they might go to the government.
That is, and I mean, it speaks to me. I would interpret that as there's one or maybe a small group, like a small team, that were dedicated to trying to do the right thing here. And I feel bad for whoever this whistleblower or whistleblower group were or was or is, if they're still with the company. But clearly they were trying to do the right thing by WPP. That is the sort of employee that you want on staff. And here the company repaid them by ignoring them for 2 years. So that is a sad statement.
Well, Matt, I suspect we're going to revisit WPP, whether or not there's an a DOJ or SFO enforcement action, just because, as with Emick Foster Wheeler, this one really is delicious and lots to talk about.
That is true, Tom. Thank you.
This is Tom Fox again. Thank you for listening to this episode of Compliance Into the Weeds. Both Matt and I have written about the WPP case, and I've linked to both of our blog posts in the show notes. We've got a new exciting podcast out on the Compliance Podcast Network, if you haven't checked it out, Effing Argentina, where along with my co-host Greg Greenberg, the author of Effing Argentina, we take up 11 tales of exasperation of modern American life. Also, I'm pleased to announce an exciting new podcast series, Design Thinking and Compliance, where together with my co-host Karsten Tams, we take up the issue of social engineering and the use of design thinking to improve your compliance program. Design Thinking and Compliance premieres in October of 2021. Thanks again for listening, and I hope you'll join Matt and I again next week where we take another deep dive into Compliance Into the Weeds. Compliance Into the Weeds is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network.
This podcast is a part of the C-Suite Radio Network. For more top business podcasts, visit c-suiteradio.com.